All right, there we go. Okay, welcome to the August 20th, 2023 Grants Pass City Council Workshop, and the council has just met in executive session to get a update with our city attorney regarding real estate property transactions and negotiations for a couple of properties on Allenwood and Sky Crest, and we're now going to have a continuation of that discussion in open session with Brad Clark.
Good smoky morning to you. So I am going to, unless you have a preference on which one of these properties, I was going to start out with the Sky Crest first.
That works.
All right. So our subject and summary today review the next steps for potential sale of these two surplus properties out on Sky Crest Drive. And there's two particular goals that it relates to there. So here's a vicinity map, general vicinity map for council. We're talking about an area that is south of town, just outside the urban growth boundary, Sky Crest Drive. Mimosa Way is also in this general vicinity. The two lots are very close to each other, one on the north side of Sky Crest, one on the south side of Sky Crest. On May 15th, council had general consensus to liquidate both of these lots. The sale was prioritized along with Starlight and 8th Street. So those are the three properties, surplus properties that council has given direction for staff to proceed with. In June, we hired real property consultants, Paul Zacca, to do an appraisal of these Sky Crest properties. And he finished his report on July 11th. There are a few findings that are probably relevant for you today. The current zonings are R5, that's a Josephine County zone. All lots in the immediate neighborhood are served either by private wells or a private water system. So there actually are several lots in that Sky Crest area that are on a private water system that don't have their own individual wells on their lots. However, these two properties, since they have not been developed, would not be able to hook up to the water system. That's according to the current licensed water consultant out there, and so they would have to have wells drilled on their property. Both of them are legal non-conforming in terms of their size. They're under the minimum size for the county zoning, but they can be built on. And they're one of Paul's findings was that what it is a stable rural residential neighborhood. This just zooms in on those two properties. Again, here's Sky Crest Drive that runs north and south. You've got Bluebell Lane close by, and then here at the intersection of Mimosa Way and Sky Crest, you have the one property on the north, and then another sort of hexagonal shaped property there on the south. And here's just a look at the aerial, heavily forested down in that part of town. A few site photos. This is of lot 1500, looking north, again on Sky Crest. The property that we're talking about is on the left-hand side there, just under the power lines. Here's again tax lot 1500, intersection of Sky Crest Drive and Mimosa. This is moving over to lot 300. This is the one that has many more contours on it, a little more challenging to develop. This is looking north. If you're at the south property line on tax lot 300, looking north. A few characteristics on these properties. Lot 300 is 1.32 acres. It's got they got that heptagon shape. Average is 15% slope. Except along the west boundary, you have a 40% slope, and that's where, in terms of vehicular access, you're going to really have some challenges, and some extra expense to get access directly to the property from Sky Crest. As I mentioned before, there's a new private well required for the domestic water as well as septic. Lot 1500, that's the slightly smaller one, 1.3 acres, the triangular shaped one. That quote there is from the appraiser, who said this does not impose severe design constraints. It has the front west line of Sky Crest and the east line of Mimosa. That one varies from 15 to 40, but has much more flat access coming off of the street. So the driveway approach is less of a challenge on 1500. And then the well and the septic are expected. Most of the other utilities as listed here are available to the properties, both of them, including electricity, phone, gas, cable, etc. The cost that the city has put into the property so far, $3,500 for the appraisal, and then expenses would be paid out of LB 6388. The city has, that's a surplus property capital account. Land valuation and appraisal. Here's the comparisons there. The real market value on those two varies somewhat from what the appraised value came in at, $140,580 and $138,750. Just a reminder that on those assessor valuations, those are, done by the county, but not every year. So that's one of the advantages of having the appraiser take a look and get us a more up-to-date cost estimate. So the call to action is at council's discretion. You can direct staff to proceed with public notice, solicitation of bids on both those lots, hold public hearings, sell lot 1500, hold lot 300 would be another option. You could continue to hold both properties as surplus property. Can take any questions.
Any questions? Rick?
Thank you, Brad. Can you go back to slide 5? I know property lines and structures are not accurate on here, but there is some indication that there could be encroachment of structures on property lines. Has there been any, I would say, conversation or on that?
There has not. The appraiser did not identify those as encroachments. At this point, we don't have any reason to believe that that would be a hindrance to the sale.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Val?
Yeah, I just have a question about the county appraisal system. So basically, these could have been appraised many, many years ago. Do we have any idea when the county actually appraised them last? Just out of curiosity.
I do not know the answer to that.
Okay, and so once they sell, does the appraisal change, or does it, I mean, maybe somebody else because I don't know that about selling property, does it go up to what you bought it for, or does it stay at the appraised value by the county?
I think we have a counselor maybe able to give some more information.
Yeah, it doesn't adjust upon sale. It just keeps going up at the normal rate unless there are improvements done to the property.
Okay, so but once they put a house or do something to the house, that's when it actually gets reappraised for the new amount. Okay, thank you. Just clarification.
Any other questions? All right.
You want to continue with Allenwood, or you want to have the discussion on Sky Crest?
Yeah, let's stop and have our discussion on this one.
Okay.
Valerie?
Yeah, I think that since this is county property and we are not going to be using it for any reason, that we should put it on the market. And I obviously, who knows when the last time that was assessed, I mean, when it was assessed, so I would put it up higher to real market prices and see if we can get the money for the property that isn't going to be used for any reason. So I guess I could make a motion to sell have the city follow through with going through the public process they need to go through for the sale of these properties. Putting the 300 at 140,000 and the 1,500 160,000. And so I guess that's my motion.
Okay, is there a second? Seconded by Rick. Any discussion on the motion? All right, Val, you made the motion to list the properties. How do you vote?
Yes.
DJ?
Yes.
Vanessa?
Yes.
Brian?
Yes.
Joel?
Yes.
Rick?
Yes.
Dwayne?
Yes.
Rob?
Yes.
Motion passes 8-0. Allenwood.
Okay. Well, this property you've had several more discussions about as council. So I'm going to spend a little less time giving you some of the development characteristics and a little more giving you an update of where we're at in terms of your potential next steps in scoping. A few things that have happened. The decision was made to sell a portion of the property for affordable housing, and we say a portion there because you have had prior discussions about holding on to some of the property as a public park. We did do a preliminary traffic assessment with DEA. We had the wetland study by Schott and Associates. We've had some discussions with ODOT staff since the frontage of that property is on ODOT facility there on Williams Highway. We've had some discussions with the adjacent property, and we had Colliers do the appraisal. So again, we're talking about 3 different tax lots here. Williams Highway on the right side of the screen, and then Allenwood Drive comes along the north part of the screen, and then you have the 2 smaller lots, and then the larger one. So you can see the on the west side that these properties are right up against the city limits and the urban growth boundary. All of them are annexed in the city limits today. The Williams Highway again runs here along the north. There's a couple of out parcels there that are outside the city limits, but these 3 properties that the city has are inside. So in terms of the future public right-of-way connection, this has been something that you've talked a little bit about. The Arroyo Drive, which is shown here with the cul-de-sac, extends up from the south, and then Allenwood Drive cul-de-sac terminates here on the north. And so the properties we're talking about are these 2 on the north and then the larger one. Now there is this intervening property that we've had some discussions with the neighbor about, they anticipate developing in the future, but they are not prepared to proceed at this time. As you may recall, that was one of the discussion points. Should we wait and put both together? Because he is not ready to move ahead, we decided to just proceed with our own process. So in terms of ensuring that we get a right-of-way connection, obviously this alignment is just very rough, but to give you a sense for what we're expecting to happen and really what our transportation plan, or not the transportation plan, but the transportation section of our development code calls for is to connect those 2 streets through there. So that would, in one scenario, that could provide the boundary, that future right-of-way between what the future park could be on the west and what you would choose to sell on the east. And that would continue on down through this property when and if it develops. We showed this to you about 6 or 8 weeks ago. This is the wetland study that came back. The blue cross-hatched areas are the delineated wetlands. They come out to the lower one, 0.09 acres, and then the larger one, closer to Allenwood, 1.04 acres. So definitely something that a developer will need to factor in and work around. While there is mitigation potential, that's pretty expensive, and generally we don't see developers going for that option. So if you gave direction to staff, we could proceed with a potential RFP, and there's a few points here that we've talked about in prior workshops. A couple of these are new based on some of the appraisal information. Retaining the ownership of 1 to 2 acres of contiguous to Allen Creek, We've talked about retaining the R18 zone and shooting for an overall density of 8 units per acre, probably a maximum of 10. There's all in this whole area within a half mile or more, you generally have the lower density residential out there. So within the R18, of course, you can build out to fourplexes and triplexes and duplexes under middle housing. So to help avoid a spot zone, the recommendation was just to keep that R18. Constructing mixed housing products, doing at least 10% of total units as middle housing. At least 10% of the units could be made affordable at the 80% AMI. Cooperating with that adjacent owner, again, on that street stub, either that one that we showed for sure and potentially another one, since these are over 8 acres that we're talking about. Ensure pedestrian and bike connection to that future park. So somehow that would be designed that there would need to be some good connection between the developer's project and the future park along Allen Creek. Continue to engage in those discussions with ODOT Development Review about the access to Williams Highway. I added the continued coordination with Schott and Associates regarding site access. When they finished their assessment on the wetlands, they did say they might want to come back and do one more review. So this would be something that we just want to have the developer be aware of and have them cooperate with Schott on. If there's any geotech analysis necessary, at this point, the recommendation would be to have that be a developer expense. But again, if council wanted to have incentives, increased incentives, that is something that the city could do ahead of time. But most likely that would not be something we would do until you actually have a design on a potential plat and a potential layout. It really doesn't make a lot of sense to go ahead and do boring holes or testing or anything like that. Project phasing would be acceptable, but at least 20 units on the first phase and expected within 2 years of property closing. And then again, we've talked about several times, we need to recoup that 1.05 million as Parks SDC. I included this in here. I'm not going to review it because we talked about this at your prior workshop on this subject, but we have some RFP scoring recommendations there that we could incorporate in that would, for an affordable housing development type project that would be potential using during the scoring process. And then if you did give direction for a RFP, here's a potential timeline that we would work off of, showing a proposal to the council in January would probably be about as soon as you would see something. And here are the expenses to date. We've had $3,800 on the real estate appraisal. We had $6,000 on the wetlands delineation. This one to date have been paid out of the planning division. And then we're showing the real market value there. As you can see, the appraised value does come in higher than the real market value, but is still below what the city spent on the SDCs, or to acquire the property, I'm sorry. So this is at your discretion in terms of how you'd like to proceed.
Valerie, go ahead. Then Dwayne.
I do have a question on the, a couple of questions. Number one, a question on the fact that it was all purchased for the purpose of the park's SDCs, correct? So if you're
Correct.
keeping part of it as a park, so how does that work out in terms of trying to recoup and assuming that part of it is going to still remain as part of the park?
Right. No, that's a good question, Counselor. I think we would need to get a valuation, most likely, on whatever the portion that is retained as a park, and assign a value to that portion, and then subtract that off of that 1.05 million.
And then another question I had, and it's kind of going back to the map of the property. There was a couple of maps that you showed. One of them, further on a little bit more, it's where you have, no, where the line is. So you're saying technically you could cut, say, I don't know if it's east-west part of that off and put that as the park and then have the east for development and then comparing that to the next part where they show the wetlands.
Mm-hmm.
So basically, I'm kind of looking at, but Allen Creek is clear over there on the left-hand side, so I guess that's why I'm confused. So where is the park? What would that be, the park place? Where exactly on that does that arroyo?
Yeah, if you
right
follow
along the
this kind of, this yellow color angle here, down and then probably, you know, likely alongside the west boundary of the wetlands.
Okay.
You know, again, all this depends on further surveying of the property. But in order to avoid that wetland boundary, and that's such a straight line because there is a ditch there.
Okay.
So there's some drainage that kind of collects in there, but most likely, yeah, we're talking about kind of running along the west side of where that wetlands is, where this street would run, the connection.
Okay. And so a question that comes up with wetlands, because obviously nobody likes the word wetlands on a piece of property that you're going to develop on. So looking at the wetlands map right there, so you're saying basically that whole section to the east of that ditch will also be unable to be utilized necessarily for building.
Most likely, yes.
How about, can you put like detention ponds and things like that in wetland areas, or how does that work? I mean, I'm just thinking outside the box here, I mean, I don't know, I'm asking people who know about development. My husband would know, but he's not here. So can you utilize that as a, detention area for the development that's going up? And then how much of that other eastern piece, I can see the waves, which are obviously are elevation, is developable.
Right. Yeah, these, you're right, this corner, this southeast corner, does have a bit of elevation to it, and then it drops down, and then but it's not so steep that you wouldn't be able to, that's unbuildable. Now, obviously that does add costs in terms of engineering and foundation work and things like that, but it's not unbuildable. In terms of this other wetland that you pointed out, that you see sometimes where those become kind of an open space area. You can sometimes do elevated boardwalks in those. You can do other types of very light impact types of activities, but that's going to be up to the developer to work around and kind of use, and if they want to potentially move that, that would have to work through State Department of Lands and Army Corps, and that's why a lot of times people just leave them alone, because that's a long process. What we've heard most recently is the Army Corps' 18 to 24 months to get a permit.
Thank you.
Dwayne?
My question is on the, she kind of hit something I was thinking about, but are you allowed to donate the property?
Sorry?
Donate this property to developers?
Well, again, that's the challenge with this particular piece is that we need to replenish the park's system development charge
So
fund.
yes, you could not donate it because you have to have the money back.
You would need to find some other way to replenish the money. Yeah.
So yes, you could donate,
You
but
could.
like Bradley said, you would then need to utilize a general fund revenue to subsidize the donation if the donation was an incentive.
And I guess I'll expand on, because it's a question, but I can have a statement later, but I was just, my statement with that donation is, that's what I was asking was, we need housing, but along with housing, if it doesn't go to nonprofits, we get tax dollars replenished our coffers. So I'm looking at ways to both win, you know what I'm saying? So if we're creating housing for people to live in, and it's not nonprofits owning this, then we get tax dollars to fill for revenue. So that's why I was asking about that question, is it gives us two things we need. You know, so that's why my statement was that way, is if we can keep it from incentivizing developers to develop to them, then we're going to get tax dollars back eventually. I mean, if we collected $100,000 a year, in 10 years, we have $1 million. So that's how I was looking at it. So that was my statement with my question.
Rick?
Thank you, Brad. So if I was a developer coming in and I wanted to do planned unit development, and I know the discussion here today has been including, would we separate out the wetlands and save that as theoretically for a park? But as a developer, if I wanted to do PUD and I wanted everything, then I could incorporate the wetlands as part of my storm drainage. I could incorporate the wetlands as part of my open area. Is that accurate? Do you see that being an advantage? If I was a developer, I could buy the whole thing and it would give me more flexibility. And would it not also allow me to increase my density on the rest of the property and actually produce more housing?
Well, the PUD itself wouldn't necessarily give you more density than what you can do through middle housing. You could do a PUD, but because of middle housing now, from a density, it's kind of makes the PUD a little less attractive, because the PUD is extra costs and extra time, and if density is the only thing you're really after, you don't need the PUD anymore.
Okay, so through middle housing, would a developer, would it be an advantage to still retain the wetlands area as part of that development?
Right.
Maybe
I mean,
not.
I think if you ask most developers, they say, I'd be happy to let the city keep that wetland. I think most would probably say that. If what you're getting at is if you just put the entire property out on sale rather than hold back just the Allen Creek frontage, that would definitely give them more flexibility to work with the overall property, because as you can see, quite a bit of that acreage adjacent to Allen Creek is not wetland.
Okay.
So
Then last question, if want more density in there, whether we're using the RFP or the other alternative is the public process, is that correct? There's the two methods. Am I understanding that correctly?
yes.
Okay. So whether either method that we use, do we still have the opportunity to put conditions on there, for instance, that through the middle housing rule, that they would achieve a certain degree of density? We have that option.
We do have the option to set that, yes.
Either way, if we chose to market it. Okay, just because we choose one method over the other, are we limited?
My understanding and reading of the statute is that, excuse me, the public notice and the public hearing portion, that's just for the open market. For the RFP process, there's a restrictive covenant that you put on because it's going to be used for affordable housing. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what conditions. I guess also it might depend on the conditions you might want to place on the property.
Okay, well, I guess what I've seen is when we start putting restrictions on there, it has to be for affordable housing. At the moment, a lot of those are bogged down in the different government regulations, and I guess I would like to see we could offer something out there, and other than the density, we don't have affordable housing locked into that.
So I think that without an alternative sales practice for city property, it's going to be one or both of those methods that I explained
Okay,
to sell property.
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear you. So
It's going to be one or both of those methods that I previously explained as to how we dispose of city-owned property. I don't know that. I mean, for the public notice process, I'm not aware of any need or necessity for the city to place conditions upon the property at all.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Brian?
Thank you. So I'm a little bit confused about this point that Rick's talking about. So we have one option where it goes through the public process, and that's just essentially putting the property up for sale. Is that correct?
Correct.
And it's just like normal property sale. There, we wouldn't be putting any sort of conditions as far as density or anything like that on it. We would just be selling the property, and whoever bought it can do what they want with it.
There's still a public hearing, but yes.
Okay. And then there's the RFP process where we have more ability to kind of affect the outcome of what is done with the property. Right?
Right.
Okay. Thank you. And then with regards to the property as a whole, I see up there this, the study site tax lot boundaries are 9.76 acres. So I would assume that is the size of all 3 tax lots.
All 3, yes.
Okay. And then the wetlands are 1.12. And then do we happen to know approximately that section that we are kind of talking about maybe keeping as a park? Do we know the rough size of that area?
We have not done that calculation. It's in that 1.5 to 2 acre range.
Okay. So 1.5, and then add the wetlands, 1.1. So I'm just trying to figure out how much buildable land we're potentially talking about for housing here. And I mean, very roughly, it's looking like maybe 7-ish acres, give or take an acre.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
I think that's
so
fair.
if it's 7 acres, just for this line of questioning, and we're talking about retaining the current R18 zoning, what kind of maximum potential of housing are we looking at here as far as what kind of, if we really kind of push this property to get as many units as possible out of it, what are we looking at?
Well, if you go with the council's direction from before, which was to kind of have a mix of housing product types and not just do, 3-plexes and 4-plexes, but to have maybe a pod of those and then maybe some duplex and maybe some single family. I mean, again, there's been no decision on this, but that's staff's interpretation of what you were looking for from prior workshops. You're ending up in that 8 to 10 units per acre. So that if you average those out, because some of those 4-plex areas you're going to be pushing more like 12 to 14 units per acre, and in the single family you're going to be more like around that 5 or 6. So, but if you average it out,
Okay.
you call it 8. So if you're talking 7-ish buildable, then
55, 60.
55, 56, yeah,
Okay.
60, somewhere in there.
Okay, thank you. And then with regards to replenishing the park's SDCs, does council have the option of using, like, let's say we go through the RFP process and we find it really hard to find someone to come on board at the price that we're looking at. Do we have the ability to kind of maybe discount that cost with proceeds from other surplus property sales? Like if we, say, sell these Sky Crest properties, could we use those funds to partially backfill the park's SDC if council chose?
You could, you may need to readdress your resolution that was adopted a couple of years ago where all sales of surplus property goes to fund system development charge incentives for affordable housing, and identify the flexibility in that resolution and a modification of that resolution that allow you to also flex those dollars for general fund use.
Okay, thank you.
Valerie?
So my question is, in looking at what we had talked about saving for the park all the way out around Allen Creek, could you actually do a different layout of the park and take in some of that wetland area and put some of the area down at the bottom that is more buildable
Absolutely. Yep, there's no limits in front of the council in terms of, where that future park would go. I mean, just remembering that, and that's part of that would be one advantage to, to the RFP process, is because you can build in kind of that upfront expectations and negotiation, and so that there wouldn't be any final sale, for example, until there's been an agreement on what that configuration looks like. But I think the key point in terms of the design is that connectivity, which Public Works has asked for, and planning, the development code asked for, to continue. So it's a local road, so you're talking, between 50 and 60 feet width, which comes through there. And then, how to reconfigure. You're right that there's this area where the 19 is one of the more flat and easily buildable parts on the property. A portion of that would be a future street, but you have some area up here on the north where maybe a park makes a little more sense. To date, we've been looking at Allen Creek itself as kind of an advantage to having that full frontage for a public park. But as you can see here, it does get pretty steep. So you'd have to work around that too. But to get to your question, Councilor, there's no limits in terms of where a future park would go. I think the goal that we've been talking about is that minimum 1 to 2 acres.
So technically, if we did get an RFP and did get some affordable housing there, then in a sense, that money that we got from the Sky Crest, or the sale of that, would be in a way helping out the affordable housing. So we might not need to change that thing, because that would be the purpose, is to make that housing affordable in some way. And that kind of leads me back to the question about the mixed housing part, whether you can do a 10% or 20% as you have up here for the potential RFP scope. If that's a possibility, if we are offering some affordable housing in the building of it, that is an okay thing to do.
DJ?
So if we're talking about reserving a portion of the property, this is going to be a difficult question to ask. Reserving a portion of the property for parkland use, does that then subsidize back the total that needs to be replenished back into Parks SDCs by what amount? By just raw acreage, or?
As Bradley mentioned, I think earlier, is the best way to do that is we would get some form of an assessment on the identified size, location of the identified parkland.
Sure.
And assign a value to that.
Okay, so you need to get an appraisal, and you couldn't just, that's a pretty official process, I think, is what I'm getting at.
Because it utilizes system development charge dollars, and those are very restrictive, I think we would be more defensible if we did something a little more formal of a process.
Thanks.
Brian?
I just have a question regarding affordable housing versus workforce housing, because in the potential RFP scope, it talks about construct mixed housing products with at least 10% of total units as middle housing, which I guess is synonymous with workforce housing. So is affordable housing considered, and forgive me for not remembering, is that like below 100% AMI is affordable housing, or is affordable housing from 80 to 120, or what is that number?
Well, usually the industry's using 80 to 120 when they talk about workforce. And then under 80 is the affordable.
Okay. So we have some flexibility. The scope here, potential says at least 10% affordable to below 80, at least 10% affordable to 100 to 120. But we do have flexibility in deciding where those percentages end up, right?
We do.
Okay, thank you.
Valerie?
Yeah, I have a question, because I think when we did ourselves write the affordable part, it was 100%. So I don't know if we need to change that or not, because it was my understanding when we actually wrote it and did it, that we made the decision to go at 100% as opposed to 120. So I don't know if it got written in that way or into that affordable housing or not.
The construction excise tax?
Yes.
It did for the construction excise tax.
Okay, but only for the
But-
construction,
right.
only for the construction excise tax.
Right.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. Discussion on this one? Brian?
I think we all would like to see some housing get built out here. It's just a matter of ironing out the details. So I would personally accept staff's recommendation to not spot zone this and not upzone this, as long as in the RFP we are, making clear, the number of units that we hope to get out of this, or the number of units that are expected to be built. Whatever that number is, I'm not quite sure what that is. I mean, it sounds like maybe it's 55 or 60 units. I would like to see those numbers for affordable and middle housing higher than 10%. I think that those segments of housing are sorely needed in town, so I would be in favor of those 10% being maybe 25% each, and that still leaves 50% for market rate. But that's initially kind of where I stand right now. And then I like Valerie's idea about incorporating the wetland into the park and maybe freeing up some of that property on the southern side for additional housing.
Anybody else? Val?
Yeah, I would agree with all of it. I'm not really sure about the, what I worry about, and I'll ask, I guess, DJ and maybe Dwayne being in that field, or Rick for that matter, whether you increase, what it would be like to, once again, pencil out. Because I think sometimes you would run into that problem with increasing the density, because then it becomes impossible for them to get enough money to make it worth their while to build. So that's my only question about increasing the rate on affordable housing.
Rick?
Brian, I like your ideas, but I'm still not totally clear. Once we put the word affordable housing in there, do we change, I would say, the ability of the investor on how he has to proceed? Is the process more simplified if we don't have the word affordable housing in there?
Brian?
Well, I'm not the expert on that, but if we do have some portion as affordable housing, then we can potentially backfill the park's SDC resources with other surplus property sales if it does come to that. And this piece of property is kind of our biggest, other than Allen Creek, it is our biggest potential for getting new housing. So I would hate to see the opportunity go by and us not get at least a little bit of affordable housing out of it.
Joel?
So one of the things that strikes me, I like everything I've heard, but we haven't discussed the risk of the previous two properties perhaps not selling at that price. Given the present market value, and that it may be a lot lower, and I would think there would still be enough there if you did it, but the city might take a loss. So I didn't hear that discussion. It assumes that the previous properties would sell at our asking price. So just an observation.
Dwayne?
I think I'll go back to my question statement again, is right now we're not getting anything out of this place. So if we do nothing, we're losing actually. That's the way I feel about it. If it's developed, we're making something. We're making housing and we're making tax dollars that help the city out. So doing nothing, I don't think is the answer. Just saying, oh, we're going to sit on it longer, which that doesn't help housing. It doesn't help income coming into the city. It doesn't help nothing. So doing something is a positive. I'd see it that way. If it's what Brian says or Valerie says, I just feel we need to do something. And the builders are going to tell us what they can do on the property. That's what's going to tell us, yeah, we like to have at least 55 homes. Maybe they're going to do a cottage cluster. I don't know yet. I think we need to sit it out there and see what happens. And we're ultimately going to vote and say yes or nay. So I don't want to get too much down the weeds of this is what you should be doing on the property. They have to do something within the parameters. So let's leave it up to them. Maybe they're going to put 75 homes on there. I don't know. So I think to guessing of what they should do is probably going to be too much because none of us are architect, engineers, or developers other than maybe DJ. He builds homes. So, and Rick.
Valerie?
Yeah, and I think with the RFP that we have in the scoring, that would probably help us all. As opposed to making it mandatory, once again, I think you'd incentivize it. And so that, with the scoring considerations that we have, that they have printed here, that it does incentivize it if they do and choose to do that. But I really do think that we should restructure the park part of it and take in the wetlands part and just top part to make as much of the buildable part of the property buildable for the whoever gets RFP.
Vanessa?
I also agree with Councilor Lovelace. I like the idea of restructuring that park area, and also I'd like to learn more about the amount that we could possibly subtract from the park SDC fund required to pay back once we figure out how much that parkland is valued at. And I do also support the RFP scope content. I do like the idea of raising the mixed housing to 25% and the affordable housing to 25%. I think that those are especially important because continuous tracts of land like this in the city are extremely rare, and I think we have to get the biggest bang for our buck here.
Rick?
I like the comments that Valerie and Dwayne are making in the fact that if we put the property out there and we're asking for potential bidders and their ideas and we start scoring them based on what they're proposing rather than locking it in. So maybe we have a better offer from somebody that's not going under the guidelines of affordable housing, and we could weigh that against somebody that's also proposing affordable housing. But if we're achieving the objectives that we want to see happen, and that's create housing, I guess I could see proceeding with less restrictions. Thank you.
DJ?
Yeah, my declared opinion on this property hasn't changed. You know, we need to put it out there, see what the market can do, see what can be built there. You know, middle housing makes this kind of an interesting conversation. You'll get your density without upzoning. It's just a matter of, does this pencil to create land on it? And heretofore, it seems like there might be some interested parties. I wouldn't be fond of going a restrictive route, as was mentioned, because we don't know what those restrictions will manifest. But we will know if we put an RFP out there with interest and highlight the things that we would like to see. We'd like to see density, we'd like to see affordability, et cetera. So I'd push in that direction.
All right, it sounds like there's probably support here for putting together an RFP that has some sort of scoring-based model that encourages density or workforce housing. Does somebody want to make a motion? Val?
Yeah, I'll make a motion. I'll give it a shot. I make a motion that we take this Allenwood Drive property, look at restructuring the parks and finding the value of the parkland with the wetlands and part of Allen Creek. And we design an RFP with the incentivizing the affordable housing and density.
seconded by Rick. Any discussion? All right. Val, you made the motion. How do you vote?
Yes.
DJ?
Yes.
Vanessa?
Yes.
Brian?
Yes.
Joel?
Yes.
Rick?
Yes.
Dwayne?
Yes.
Rob?
Yes.
Motion passes 8-0. All right, nice job, guys. Next. Reinhart Volunteer Park. Here comes Josh.
Good afternoon, Council. Josh Hopkins, Park Superintendent. Let me see here. Bear with me while I pull up the presentation. Just so Council is aware, we did make sure to invite the Parks Committee as well as the Urban Tree Advisory Committee Chair. Neither were able to make it today. However, James Pasley is our urban forester and is kind of the lead for that committee, for the Urban Tree Advisory Committee, if you guys do have follow-up questions for what they've been working on. I act as the lead for the Parks Committee, so I can follow up with that as well. And we also have Councilor King, who I believe is the liaison for both. And then in this presentation, we will have a reference to Rogue Valley Council of Governments. Just so Council is aware, their Natural Resource Coordinator, Amy Selecki, is here, and she can answer any questions about their programs if Council has any towards the end of the presentation. All right, so we're here today to discuss the Reinhart Volunteer Park vegetation. For our subject and summary, Council has expressed interest in having the vegetation maintenance performed around the wetland area of Reinhart Volunteer Park. I'll probably reference it as RVP moving forward, near the pedestrian bridge. This meeting is to update Council on the current progress, potential plan of action, and provide an opportunity for Council feedback. It's in relationship to Council goals of maintain, operate, and expand our park infrastructure to meet community needs. For the background, on July 6, 2022, at a City Council meeting, Councilor D. LaGrange requested more information regarding options for Himalayan blackberry removal near the pedestrian bridge at RVP. In July of that year, staff did reach out to Department of State Lands and the Department of Fish and Wildlife to review various regulations and prepared a memo that was submitted in August of 2022, updating Council on various limitations that we found from the wetlands being associated there, as well as regulatory and development code and replanting cost. In that memo, we basically let Council know that, DSL, Department of State Lands, has regulatory authority for what happens underneath the ordinary high water line, as well as within a wetland boundary. And we would need to file for permits if we were going to go in and do a lot of disturbance in those general areas, as well as we talked about how ODFW doesn't have a real regulation, but they do have a recommendation for replanting that was going to cost a significant amount at that time. Since then, we have, continued to work on this, and we've learned more about what those limitations are and where we can kind of save on the replanting and things like that. Then in December of 2022, the Rogue Valley Council of Governments reached out regarding volunteer possibilities in our parks, and this location was identified as a potential site. Back in 2021, they actually came out and did some ivy removal of the trees in the wetland area and hung some bird boxes and things like that. So they were familiar with the site. In January 2023, staff reviewed the wetland at RVP with Rogue Valley Council of Governments Natural Resource Coordinator, Amy Selecki, and she is in the audience, as I mentioned earlier. And then in February 2023, we held a follow-up meeting with Rogue Valley Council of Governments Natural Resource Director, as well as the coordinator, just to solidify that this was a project they would be kind of interested in looking at from a volunteer aspect. For our point, the volunteer aspect is very important to us. It's a labor force that we don't actually have available to us currently, and so it allows for us to do a lot more with a lot less resources type of a thing. Then in March of 2023, staff held a meeting with representatives from the Department of State Lands and Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife and Rogue Valley Council of Governments, basically talking to these agencies to see where we were going to run into our issues with the wetlands and what we were going to be able to do as far as potentially removing some of the blackberries, putting in a trail system and things like that. And at that meeting, we were able to gain a lot more information about where our limitations were. Essentially, as mentioned, our DSL jurisdiction underneath the ordinary high water line as well as the wetland boundary. And then our development code that we've been working with is Article 23343, and it does require replanting within 90 days and submitting a replanting plan for vegetation removed along the banks. So what really came out of that meeting was the need to establish where that ordinary high water line is as well as the wetland boundary, because outside of that we were going to be able to do a lot more without needing to go through permitting processes for the large-scale removal that would be required. And then in May 23, the city solicited Schatz and Associates to perform the wetland delineation work at RVP. And in June 2023, Rogue Valley Council of Governments did apply for a grant for restoration work for the trail building. This included adding some volunteer labor, bird boxes, bat boxes, blackberry removal and restoration activities, a chip trail development, potentially a pollinator garden, and adding interpretive signs. Rogue Valley Council of Governments, we have other agreements in place that they do this type of work for us based off our MS4 permits and things like that. And then in August 2023, we did get the completed delineation report from back to the city from Schatz and Associates. I think it was on the 14th when we actually got that back in hand this month. So just to walk through a little bit, this is what it looked like back in 1975. This is the area we've been talking about right here. Here's where the pedestrian bridge goes across, and this is the bank of the Rogue River along Reinhart Volunteer Park. Moving forward, 2007, you can see it's still pretty densely vegetated. This is one of my favorite photos we have available to us because it was taken during the winter or fall, so we're able to really see inside of it. And you can see that, yep, along this entire area, we still have the blackberry bushes all going down along here, and then generally back in that direction. The reason I bring these up is just to show that this isn't something that's just popped up over the last few years. We've got decades of this type of growth going on in Reinhart Volunteer Park. So here is our current location and what it looks like today. We took this photo or this drone video last week. You can see we actually ended up cutting trails into it to be able to do the delineation work, which inadvertently kind of helped us two birds, one stone when it comes to creating a trail system in here. And then as you go around, right in this area is where the wetland is. Right down here, we did have a small fire last week in this area, and that's kind of where we were talking about putting the pollinator garden, so we can use that to our advantage as well. And then all along the bank here, you can see it's pretty dense vegetation. This is a mixture of vines, some variation of a grape species, blackberries, and other more native vegetation. And then the wetland drains out right in this area right here. You can see it's constantly wet along the bank line right there from where the wetland drains. One thing to note about this section of bank is it's pretty much all concrete. I'm not sure when it was poured in the river, but it's pretty much an entire concrete shelf. There's really only a few feet of shoreline, and it's all slick and everything like that because it's concrete that's constantly wet. And then going up the bank is a pretty steep embankment. It's not one of these spots that gradually slopes down to a river, to a nice sandy spot or a nice rock spot. Additionally, we do have access underneath the pedestrian bridge here, as well as on the other side of the vegetation line, we've got access next to our water pump. So you pretty much have the ability on either side to walk that whole bank, depending on where you go. When it comes to the wetland delineation map, this is what we got back from Schatz and Associates. It's the preliminary map. Essentially, we were just looking to get them to come out and establish where that boundary is. And you can see in most of these areas, we don't have a wetland issue or an ordinary high water line issue, so we are able to go in and do a little bit more heavier removal without having to get permits through DSL, as well as it lowers some of our replanting requirements 20, 30 feet back from the actual river line and the ordinary high water line. Yep.
Mike?
We'd have to replant blackberries?
No, essentially, we'd be able to replant.
You
any
keep
sort
saying
of native-
replanting, and I'm like, thinking in my head, blackberries, those things grow up on their own. And then there was a second fire now at the park?
Yeah, last week there was a small fire in that general location, and then there was one a few weeks back.
Thank you.
Yep.
I have a quick question too. I'm taking a look at that gray area. You said it's the Rogue River OH high water. Is that correct? So that's what you're talking about when you're talking about the high river mark?
Yeah,
we
this
can't-
area
we
right
can't-
here would be the ordinary high water line.
Okay, so that, and you're saying the concrete is where located on that?
The entire ordinary high water line.
Okay.
The way that bank works is pretty much the majority of Reinhart Volunteer Park down past a little bit past the Harry and David shelter is basically concrete all along the bank there. And then it goes up onto where the bank comes down in general areas, there's about 15, 20-foot drops off of those spots. And then the shoreline itself is basically a big flat thing of concrete that goes off and creates a shelf that drops off about 15 feet into the river.
And is that all the way along the high water mark?
Yeah.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Joel?
So if the public did have free access to that area, is it dangerous to kids and that kind of thing?
Public already has access to that area.
So
and-
I'm talking about the steep banks and the concrete along the whole length of the.
Yeah, that's
where the
another
access
slide
is,
moving forward, but
it's a little,
essentially that is one of the limiting factors we have listed in one of the other slides is opening up access can potentially create more liabilities for you, which I'll explain here in a little bit.
yeah, so if a 5-year-old falls over that bank, can they get back up?
Depends on the 5-year-old.
Okay.
So like I was saying, here's the wet lot or the wetland boundary. Essentially, if it's inside the wetland boundary, we're able to do manual removals, but we wouldn't be able to take a lot of heavy equipment or anything like that in there unless we got permitting through DSL, which is Army Corps and things like that. When we met out there last week, the Rogue Valley Council of Government brought something so that they could kind of walk some of the boundary trails that we made. As I mentioned earlier, we did create some trails to get into establish that wetland boundary, and kind of makes sense that if you're trying to create a trail around to establish the boundary, you end up kind of creating a trail around where the wetland is. And they were able to identify a potential route. This is the initial concept for it. Essentially, what we'd be looking to do as staff is go back out, flag it out, and make sure we pick the routes we want. And that gives us our basis for where we'd be maintaining until we can get chips on the ground and things like that. And really, our plan is kind of solidified the volunteer activities and assistance the Rogue Valley Council of Governments is able to offer without really committing too much on either our side or their side that overextends our resources. And then if this partnership is fruitful in future years, we can look to expand out the scope and potentially do more in this region. But knowing our own limitations on staffing and resources, we're kind of trying to start a little small once we have a community partner on board too. So a few of these limiting factors for a larger removal. City staff and financial resources for ongoing maintenance and years of successive treatment is one of our largest limiting factors for a large-scale removal in this area. And then there's the likelihood of further strain on those resources for parks if public safety funding is not stabilized in the next by the end of this fiscal year. With that, what I'm talking about is right now we could do manual removals, but we don't really have the staff power to go down there with the trimmers, so we end up contracting that out. Additionally, when it comes to mechanical removers, that'd be mowers, flails, things like that, mulchers. We don't actually have any of those equipment for this type of work in-house, and we also don't have the staff availability to perform that work, so we'd end up contracting that out as well. And that's not just a one-time contract. That would be something that would need to be done numerous times over the course of several years to be able to eradicate out the species you want to get rid of, as well as then go back in and replant the species you're wanting to keep. So it does create that successive ongoing maintenance that a larger scale removal does create a pretty big barrier for us. We wouldn't want to run in a situation where we cut it down once this year and it's all back basically in 2 years because we haven't been able to go back in and do anything else to the property. Then, as Councilor King was kind of alluding to, we do have liability issues from opening up and maintaining access to a steep bank. This is something all public land managers kind of struggle with when they do have waterways or other activities like this that have some sort of feature that has these types of steep banks, is kind of what do you do about that? As it stands, the vegetation on site is providing more of that natural buffer. We do have about 9 locations in Reinhart where users themselves have created trails to go down to the river, and they pretty much have full access to the river from those 9 locations. Those aren't areas that we're actively maintaining, nor are the areas that we promote. You do run into situations where if you start actively maintaining these trails, you start promoting these trails as a use type of a thing, and these trails are not kept at a level that is safe or ADA accessible or anything else like that, it can increase your liability and hurt things as far as recreational immunity goes. So that is one of the other issues. A lot of times when you have a bank like this and you open it up, you end up putting up like split rail fencing or something along the lines of that to create that buffer that kind of says, don't go here. And then if your bank doesn't really have a slopage to be able to create some sort of better steppage or anything like that, you kind of just let the user groups create their own trails and really try to stay out of it. And then a lot of places end up going back and decommissioning those user-created trails because of those liability issues. Also, we have other ecological concerns that could happen without replanting. Essentially, there's bank stabilization from just removal of the vegetation if we don't go back and replant. And then we do have more concerns from erosion from user-created trails. If we're opening up this whole bank access, people are going to start diving off this general area, and that can create more erosion as well. And then we're removing current habitat for birds and other species. While the invasive Himalayan blackberry isn't great to have at any time, it does provide habitat for a lot of mammals, birds, micro mammals, things like that. It's been in this site for decades, so there is plenty of habitat concerns for that as well. And then other consideration we have is a lack of infrastructure for supporting the establishment of watering. We would have to figure out a way to get water down there if we're planting plants to do this. Essentially, most places 2 to 3 years for establishment watering to be able to get your plants to thrive. Where we've talked about putting the pollinator garden is close enough to our irrigation system that we think we can actually water it just by adjusting that system. However, if we're doing a full removal of this entire bank or anything like that, that really hinders our ability to water that in the future. And then there's just some other considerations. If the idea was to promote more river access in general, this spot is accessible on both sides of this vegetation by the pedestrian bridge as well as down by the pump. You're able to walk pretty much the entirety of the bank that's there. Depending on where the water line's running that day, the bank may be 6 inches, it may be 2 feet. It just depends on how they flow the road that day. And then we do have historic photos that show at similar levels of vegetation back to the 1950s. That one was a black and white, so you can't really see what it is, but it's just one of those things. This isn't some new issue that's arisen at the city. It's something that, you know, has been in this location and part of this general ecology of that region for decades. So for cost implications, as far as revenue sources, we're really just operating out of the park's operation budget, which is general fund. I believe at the council memo for August, we talked about potentially adding some general fund dollars to our budget to budget for removals or things like that. That wasn't really added this budget cycle because we were, you know, trying to be as tight as we could with our budget. So right now we're still kind of just operating in that, you know, we're spending $1 here. It means we're just not spending $1 somewhere else. And on the staff level, we're identifying where those spots are. Additionally, Rogue Valley Council of Governments did receive, I believe it was $2,000, and they let us know that last week to potentially aid in this. The request was for a little bit more, but this is basically a stepping stone to start that partnership to see where we can go from there. For expenses, as of right now, we spent about $4,000 on the wetland delineation, and then for brush clearing to make those trails into the wetland delineation was about $900. Our known future expenses right now would be about $900 and more of brush clearing. That's once we've established where we want this trail system to lie. We'd have a crew come back in, cut that area out, and try to gain it or time it up with when the volunteers would be available so we can do it all at once. And then we might have to come back and do another treatment later down the road. For the crew we used, it was the community service crew. It's about $450 a day to have them come out and do this type of work. And in this case, we have them do this for a little bit and then switch over to something else in RVP. Then for unknown expenses for consideration is just more contract expense if we were to do a larger clearing project, and then the replanting costs for a larger project. With that replanting cost, since we know most of this is in an upland area, we do have the ability to not plant as much as what was originally put into the council memo. It's just we would need to replant things to restabilize the bank and everything else like that, and they need to be species appropriate. And then it's the infrastructure upgrades for the replanting and the establishment. So for the call to action is just feedback on the project at council's discretion. And for alternatives, we have to move to an additional workshop. Council could additionally schedule an on-site field session to review the location if you guys wish, or provide direction on an alternative plan. And then, as always, council can say just don't proceed with the project this time.
Dwayne?
Yeah. Can you speak to the issues, because I've had a couple of constituents talk to me about people sleeping in the blackberries and stuff like that. Can you tell us what kind of issues they're having down there, or if they are having issues, or?
So it's yes and no. It's kind of one of those things we have had in the past. People come into Reinhart and sleep in the blackberries. And it's not just in this location, it's any location that we do have blackberry bushes throughout the park system. People can work their way into them. Reinhart, it doesn't happen that frequently, but it still does happen just like any of our other parks. It's just at Reinhart, we usually see it a lot quicker, and so we're able to call people in, and PD is obviously able to enforce easier at Reinhart than other locations. As far as this location right now, I mean, there's definitely unhoused individuals that have walked down through that area, just as there's regular citizens that, you know, have houses that have walked down through that area since the trail's kind of been cut out.
Any other questions? Valerie, then Brian?
Okay, first of all, I want to thank Amy and the Rogue Valley Council of Governments for the cleanup they did on the river. I mean, I'm the liaison, and I didn't know anything about it, but I was quite impressed and very happy to see you go down and do that and work with our city. So that was really exciting to see. And I am encouraged by the partnership with Rogue Valley Council of Governments. So to me, that's a plus. But once again, we come down to the same place, which is money for it. But I would like to do something with the Rogue Valley Council of Governments. I love the idea of the pollinator area. So, you know, looking at what can be done with their help in a minor, I would be interested in doing something like that. So that might be a possibility to do something partial and not grander than that. And then my second question is, are goats a possibility to just turn them loose in areas like this? Is that something that I know other places use goats? Just kind of curious as if cities are allowed to use goats as well.
So starting with the first, yeah, like I mentioned earlier, they did request more funding. They were partially funded for what they requested, so we'll just figure out what it is we can do with them at that point and like kind of come up with that priority. And, you know, that's our general plan here, is to take this step by step, see what we can get going, and then, you know, if we need to bring a little resources over and we're able to identify that on our side of the budget, we're able to identify that. And then Rogue Valley Council of Governments has spoken about how, you know, they'll continually look for these types of grants that they normally go out for and things like that to help aid with this work. As far as goats go, that's always a possibility. Goats generally do better, though, after you've already cut down the blackberries or you've at least trimmed them out. When it comes to the initial removal, they're just not as efficient. But yeah, many places use goats as a part of that. You have your own issues that come with goats, like where they want to go. They're hard to keep in place, and then they're going to walk out on that concrete shelf and walk away. So, but no, I mean, we could look at goats. There's other options as well for that larger removal too, outside of just using mowers and things like that. It's just, you know, fleshing out what's the most feasible for this location.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Brian?
Yeah, thank you. So regarding replanting, I know that is probably a big cost and a big, you know, time user for something like this project. And so is it the case that the farther we get from the bank, the less replanting we have to do? Is that how it generally works?
Yeah, so once we're outside of where our development code would require us to replant, And then we're not working inside of DSL's areas that would require replanting. Replanting is kind of left up to us. However, we would be completely foolish to remove a bunch of these blackberries and not go in and replant, because essentially they're just going to come back. The best way to kind of maintain them is to have successive rounds of maintenance as well as replanting. And generally, the replanting needs to be pretty dense. So even with that, if we're actually going to try to get these guys out without dropping gallons and gallons of chemicals on the ground, the only way we'd be able to do that is with a dense planting and then successive treatment. That's more on the manual side at that point, because you're not wanting to go back in and cut down what you replanted. So replanting is two costs. There's the initial cost of replanting and the staff time that goes into that, as well as the ongoing maintenance side of it, because we would need to water it for 2 to 3 years to get it established, so that we're not just wasting the plants that are in the ground. The watering side's another issue that we do have. We do have a water truck, but it's likely to get stuck if we were to drive it all the way down towards the river to run hoses out there. So it kind of creates another issue where we'd have to look at, is it feasible to run a water line in a lateral and put a new zone in to actually go in this area to water it. But those are all things we could work out down the road. Is like more of the future things. Like the general idea is we start with what we're working on right now with getting the trail in place, maybe some interpretive signs, some of those other amenities, and then we branch out from there over successive years as funding becomes available. Maybe we take back a larger section of the blackberries and it's closer to the lawn area, so we're able to just turn that into lawn, so we're able to just mow that as well as have watering that goes to it. But when it comes to the bank itself, that's where we run into our biggest difficulty of replanting and actually getting establishment watering out to that area.
Okay, and that area you said is ODFW?
So ODFW doesn't have jurisdiction in that area. They do have planting recommendations. One of the things that their staff member brought up was that he really would appreciate if the city adjusted the development code to make it an ODFW approved replanting plan. Several cities, he said, has done this, because the way it's currently written in the code is that you just have to have a plan, but there's no metric for the city staff to say, oh, this plant isn't the right type of species or isn't something that they'd be able to accept. So ODFW is more in line of just being a partner at this point, and then they provided guidelines about, you know, waiting until the end of June to cut down the bushes and things like that, because bird species are using them for nesting and everything.
Okay, so the ODFW, they're guidelines, they're not requirements, but they're
Correct.
recommended. Okay. And then with regards to liability issues surrounding the bank and the steepness, I mean, I've been to many parks, even parks in this city where, you know, or say county parks where there's, you know, you got steep banks all over the place. So what's the difference, I mean, between any of those other steep banks and this steep bank?
It comes down to a level of maintenance and what you're providing for it. There's been a few cases in the last few years that have really pushed what you can use recreational immunity to cover. And one thing that generally fails is once you've actually taken over maintenance of an area, then you've got what are kind of considered known hazards of that area. And if you're not doing anything to mitigate a known hazard, not only is that an issue for your city, but it's an issue for any staff member who could be sued individually.
Okay. And then you also mentioned earlier that down in this area there are some user-created trails. How does...
Over the last 30, 40 years, fishermen have just been accessing spots they want to fish. And with that, they generally will just trim the blackberries out as they walk down there the first day of fishing season. It's just one of those things that's hard to keep people out of it. Some places do go around decommissioning those trails and blocking off any sort of bank access because of liability issues. Some places just kind of let it go, and if somebody gets hurt, we lean on recreational immunity, explaining it's not a designated route type of a thing. And so that's what keeps our liability lower, is that although we know that these areas exist, it's not something we're actually promoting as a spot.
So if I go down there as a citizen with some clippers and decide to trim some blackberries, that's okay?
It's against municipal code, actually, but, you know, people do it.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? Joel?
So I just had two questions. I'm used to having NOAA course, they're a federal agency dealing with endangered species involved, but ODF says we don't have to, or ODF and W said we don't have to involve them, and so there's no take. I would take it.
So when it comes to the endangered species, they're worried about the salmon and stuff like that along the road. Additionally, we do have a wild and scenic section down the way. I'd have to check, but, you know, really DSL is the one that we normally would be working with on this as far as the fisheries and the river, as well as ODFW, when it comes to that. And one of them may be acting as like a subsidiary for NOAA, similar as how DSL helps act as a subsidiary for like Army Corps of Engineers.
Right. I know we've been putting together the urban forest management plan and using different cities as a prototype, and they deal with endangered species and with NOAA on the west side of Oregon, especially with the salmon. The other thing I'm very familiar with, developed recreation along water. There's a lot of developed recreation along water. And where we have steep banks, typically you have fence to manage the situation a little safer and with the public. And this situation, I guess, would not warrant that type of precaution. I know on the places I was raised on the Mississippi, and that's a bigger river, obviously, like the Columbia, but it applies to some of the smaller rivers that go into the Mississippi. And then on the upper Rogue, where we have developed recreation, there's always fences.
So that goes back to what level of maintenance we're promoting in this area. When I mentioned a little earlier, a lot of places do add some variation of fencing when they open up these riverbanks. For our current plans, it would be basically to create a trail system around the wetland area, maybe open up a few areas towards the riverbank, but not anything that goes over the riverbank. So we'd still have all of our natural vegetation that's providing that buffer in this area currently.
Right. I think your incremental plan will get us where we want to go. It'll just take a little bit of time.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions? Nope, okay,
Sorry, I had one more.
go ahead.
I was just going to ask if our guest had anything they would like to say about the topic.
Amy, is there anything you wanted to add? Okay, she says Josh has it handled. All right, discussion, council, did you want to proceed with work in this area? DJ, then Val?
No.
Valerie?
I actually like working with the Rogue Valley Council of Governments to modify and do something small. I like the idea of that maybe making a trail to the pollinator and doing a pollinator area and maybe even to the wetlands, but I don't particularly want to open up the steep banks and go down there.
Joel?
Well, I think the objectives are well thought out and very worthy. I think I don't think we need to have any more action really to collaborate with the Rogue Valley Council of Governments and those grants, because it's not and to make some incremental progress towards those goals. And as we do that, I think we can monitor implementation and go down there. I walk along there, probably once a week. People are down at the river with their dogs, and there's a lot of trails down there already, as everybody knows that's been there. But to make things, have that trend get where they get a little better every year, I think is very worthy and cost efficient.
Anybody else? Dwayne?
I was down there a couple weeks ago, and I was quite impressed because I was thinking it was going to be all overgrown. So there was some new trails down there through the blackberries, and I hadn't been bound through there. So I thought it was pretty nice, and I would be okay with continuing working on making nice paths and stuff that are just to the blackberries and trails for people. And I was, I like to see the people walking their dogs and everything down there using the park as they were supposed to. So I'd be okay with this moving forward, what their proposal was, and continue working that partnership.
Vanessa?
I second that. And I think if there's volunteers willing to help us out, we should take full advantage of that.
Anybody else jumping in? All right, sounds like we're on the right path with some paths. All right. Agenda review, we have some committee motions to take a look at here. There's actually 3 as we talk about agenda going forward. Parks Advisory Committee has made a motion recommending the council adopt the new master plan pending the inclusion of an updated acknowledgement section. So they have been working on updating the master plan. It sounds like the acknowledgement section is just not quite done yet. Historical Building and Sites Commission has made a motion recommending the removal of a commissioner due to 3 consecutive unexcused absences. And the Tourism Advisory Committee has made a motion recommending the City Council update the city's TLT, tourism lodging tax, or transient lodging tax, I think, collection to incidental charges and match the state taxation collection method. So this is kind of a technical recommendation based on the way that the tax is listed and charged. And it's got that extra paragraph here of call to action that I don't think you probably need me to read to you. Anyway, if these things catch your attention to put them on the agenda, we can do that. First of all, we have a meeting coming up this Wednesday. Our council action items are to have a second reading of the ordinance that would implement a public safety utility fee, a resolution for a matching grant for the Jessinghouse Family Revocable Trust, a resolution that would extend the Bragg grant for the 3 Peaks Holdings. And then we have consent calendar item, a resolution that would approve the recompete grant. Oh, that one got moved, actually. That one will come back up in September. How about a motion that would acknowledge the May financial report as well as the July investment report? We are moving the HAC committee appointments, but we will look at appointing Parks Committee members as well as Sustainability and Energy Action Task Force, or committee members, committee these days. And then our next workshop would be 2 weeks from today. That might be 3 weeks from today. To look at permitting for park services. And I'm not sure what that is off the top of my head here. And then CFEC parking reform update and final option. That's the climate friendly. What is the park services permitting?
That's the item that was going to have further discussion by council with the members of the community.
Of course, okay. Yeah. I guess that's just not the way I think of it, but yeah, okay. Questions on those? Valerie?
Yeah, I just have a question on the park services. Do we know who has been invited to that? Has that been acknowledged and who's attending?
Did submit a list of individuals to the city manager, and I believe that it's going to be everybody from Mint and those associated groups. I don't remember whether or not we had Parks Advisory coming as well, but we are going to be reaching out to all of these groups who are out in the parks on Thursdays.
DJ?
About the committee motions?
Yeah.
Parks Advisory, I don't necessarily understand what that one is. Historic Building Site Commission, that seems straightforward. We need to get that on the a meeting. And then the Tourism Advisory Committee, where, I can say I kind of understand what that is. I need more information on it to pursue that motion.
Okay. I think that the master plan, that's just going to come up, right? As soon as it's done, it's going to hit the agenda as part of the normal route for that.
Yeah, those are comprehensive plan amendments. So we do need to run that through the UAPC first.
Okay.
So I think we just wanted to make sure that council was informed. You know, it's moving ahead. Parks Committee finally got their motion to you. So unless there's any changes, and unless Josh correct me, I think, yeah, we will just proceed with the normal comprehensive plan amendment process.
Okay, and then the committee member for HBSC, that needs to be a motion on the council agenda, probably just consent unless anybody has anything else with it.
So I'm the liaison to both the parks and the commission, and to remove a council member requires council action appropriately. On the other one, it's the council actually told the Parks Committee to look at the master plan and bring it back to us, but it was like 5 years ago. So they finally got it done, and they've updated it. There's no major changes. The changes are what has reflected from council decisions.
Valerie?
Yes, thank you, Joel, because I do remember asking for it, and I've actually asked a couple times how they're doing. So I think it's only a no-brainer to get it out there and put it on the agenda, a meeting.
Yeah, it's very appropriate that we look at it.
Yeah, I think that one just has a normal route of progression. Sounds like it'll go to UAPC before it comes back to us. Tourism as Advisory Committee motion, does that, I don't know that that's something that requires a workshop, but does anybody want to try to brave explaining what that is, Aaron? Brian does?
Well, essentially, in a nutshell, it applies the TLT to incidental fees that the person incurs while on site. So it adds, in addition to the room fee, it adds other incidental charges are also taxed that are on the bill.
So if you use the mini bar, it would add it to...
That's my understanding.
Okay.
Yeah, it's pet fees, other use fees, extra storage fees, right? Which this was actually raised by the chair of TAC, by Doug, who brought it up in his experience with the hotel industry. He is the hotelier representative on TAC. Initiated that conversation. So yeah, but it would require a change to how we locally set up our fee structure for that. Although it is consistent with the state.
To be consistent with the state. Okay. Brian?
I would like to get that on the agenda. I think it makes sense to do that.
Rick?
I was at that meeting, and Doug basically said other jurisdictions already do that, so thank you.
Okay. I don't think that needs a workshop. Let's just move forward with putting it on a business meeting. All right. Anything about the next couple of weeks or this week's meeting? We're good there? Okay. Anything for the long term that we need to get on there? DJ?
Sorry, going back to the tourism, yeah, let's put it on a business meeting, but I'd like to not see it on a consent agenda.
Yep.
Council action, please. Thank you.
Sounds good. Probably could use some explanation there. Valerie?
Yeah, I know that we need to move forward with, with our public safety. And I know that it was brought to the attention that we should probably have a service level, because at one point in time that we were discussing whether we needed to add a couple of things on our service level before we made the final amount possible. So I would like to see that on the agenda as soon as possible so we can move forward with that.
I'm sorry, it was service levels in regards to public safety?
Yeah, public safety, because we had talked about the fact that if we were going to be putting a fee on the water bill, that people might expect to see a little bit, some certain things that we currently are not doing because we financially can't. An example, maybe increase our CRT down in the parks, the number of people, so we had it more full-time as opposed to right now we currently have 2, and I think they're 4 days a week or whatever. So just to have that discussion as to whether we're going to keep our current level or whether we want to increase that level a notch or two before going forward, which would increase the service level before we finalize the amount that we're going to do for the water fee.
Okay. Rob?
A few things. A couple of them are really minor. Well, one of them is actually not minor at all. But we got a couple of memos this morning. One was about changing buffers at Gilbert Creek and Park, and the other one on the other side of town during school times. And I was just wondering, they said copies of that memo were available at a couple different places. And I guess I'm asking Aaron, why was it that the Finance Department is one of the places that you would access a memo about park buffers?
In the municipal code, the Finance Department is one of the entities listed for who gets the park rules. I'm not sure why, but it is listed in there.
So there's not necessarily any finances involved?
No, that's correct. It doesn't mean that finance is involved.
The other one was about the properties east of Baker Park, the different options for possibly clearing camouflage and hiding spots and so on and so forth. So you sent us a memo. What are we supposed to do with that?
That memo is just for your information, to give you an update on what we've done and our intent to meet with the Homeowners Association and provide them with that similar information. So it's just an update on our findings.
So there's no council actions needed for any of that, or?
That's correct.
The other thing too is, I mentioned, I think in 3-on-1 or whatever it was, or maybe, but with regards to public safety funding, you know, there was questions that I had about Ashland food and beverage tax that we never had answered, and I wanted to bring it up in front of the whole council. You know, recently I haven't been very vocal about it, but in 15 and even now, even though I haven't been vocal about it, I was probably as anti-sales tax, general sales tax, as anybody in the city, and was very active in 15 and working against that. However, on a very limited, we'll call it sales tax, a food and beverage tax, I look at that as a very different concept. Any of the, what I would call reasonable, or I would even call them intelligent discussions that you could have that would dissuade people against a general sales tax, I think many of those could actually be, are not really applicable to a food and beverage tax. The last time the food and beverage tax was put before the voters in Grants Pass, I think was about 2007. So it's pretty much ancient history. We don't really know how people necessarily feel about that. And many of the reasons that I'd be against the general sales tax don't apply to a food and beverage tax at all. So I was hoping, and we found, I believe, if I understood the figures right in one of the memos, that from Ashland, I believe they raise about $2.5 million a year in their food and beverage tax. I know one of the other councilors looked at that memo and thought it was far less, but that's the way I read it. And we were trying to figure out, or at least in a question that I had asked Aaron and JC, we're trying to figure out how that might apply and figure in Grants Pass as far as how many potential contributing businesses there would be to such a tax. And would that be closer to Ashland's $2.5 million? Could it be closer to $4 or $5 million? And how might, and obviously that would affect dramatically the amount of a utility fee that we might that we might consider. So I would like to go forward and look at that, and I'm hoping that JC's finally, because it was a few weeks ago now, I was able to contact the finance department in Ashland and get more details, some of the questions that I had asked. So he walked in right at the right time. Were you able to find out more information on that?
So no, not from the city of Ashland. However, I did reach out to the League of Oregon Cities for one of their lobbyists to ask if they have any state contacts for economists that we could ask to do some numbers for us. Unfortunately, that's just not something that the state of Oregon even seems to be in the business of. So they don't have a good economist for us to help us run those numbers.
So we were trying to contact the city of Ashland to get an idea how many businesses they have contributing to that tax. Is that what we're waiting for?
So yeah, I was contacting them on multiple fronts. The implementation of how they got to where they got to, how they came to their municipal code and how it's written, the percentage and the revenue in which they looked at to get to there, and why they were getting there. And then I got that question that you proposed just a little bit ago of how many businesses they currently have in comparison to their sales tax revenues, and I still have not gotten any word back from the city of Ashland.
Rob, didn't we already have a memorandum? Didn't the staff already prepare a memorandum? Could you recirculate that for folks just to refresh their memory? I'm sure you still have it on your computer.
Yeah, the city of Ashland's financial reports are all online too, so I can re-forward that link in that email.
Yeah, there was a memo, and that's what I was referring to on the 2.5 million. But if you, off the top of your head, JC, does that figure strike you as being accurate?
The city of Ashland, I want to say, was closer to 4 million.
4 million. I don't remember that, but yeah, so maybe we do need to see the memo again for sure. But to me, that's something that we haven't really looked at, and I view that, quite frankly, and I know that I'm a business that would be paying that tax, so it's not like I'm throwing that on other people. A lot of people would say the only fair tax is the tax on other people, but my business would be affected by that. But I actually view that closer to low-hanging fruit than I would, yeah, that'd be quoted, great, thanks. But closer to low-hanging fruit than I would the utility fee. So I really would hope that the council would consider that. I don't see a lot of practical, real-world negative to food and beverage tax.
All right, sounds like we have some still unresolved issues regarding public safety funding, so we will take another look at that. Aaron?
We could maybe combine that discussion and have it at the same meeting where we're talking about utility fee level of service and this potential food and beverage tax as an additional revenue stream for that level of service.
Yes, I think we have public safety issues. We got all kinds of hands going up too. I think, Rick, is yours on public safety? DJ, is your comment? Okay, go ahead, DJ.
Do we have council favor to have the discussion on food and beverage tax? I just want to clarify that we have 3 or more councilors that want to entertain this. I say it from Rob, just making sure.
We do.
Okay, good.
Yeah, we
good.
do. Okay. Rick?
Part of our discussion today on surplus property listed the 8th Street, and I know somebody in the past indicated some interest in the 8th Street property. What is the status on that now? Is there any movement for coming back to council for taking that forward, or?
Yeah, we have a couple of letters out to those parties who had contacted the city that we knew had expressed interest to see if they would like to make a bid, and we're waiting on that. And so if we get that back, that we would go through that, the same property disposal process that Augustus talked about earlier.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, other topics for agenda review? Vanessa?
A couple weeks ago, Councilor DeLaGrange had asked for a workshop later this year on how the city can help other groups or organizations meet the goal of creating a homeless shelter in the city. So I was just wanted to bring that back up as a reminder. Get it scheduled, please.
Okay. I don't see that on the back. I'm looking to see if we have it hiding somewhere on the front. Not seeing it. Okay, I'm writing it down. Rick?
Is it appropriate to make a comment at this time?
I guess so.
I want to say I was downtown this weekend, and the new signs are up advertising the historic district, and they are very nice looking. Thank you.
They do look nice. Brian?
I was just going to follow up on Rick's question about the property earlier and ask the same question about the Starlight property, just what the status is there.
Yeah, so you had a concept that kind of showed some potential building lots right behind Sunset, behind the existing ones, and then maybe retaining the steeper slope part. So we have finally got a response to some inquiries for surveyors in order to look at creating a property line adjustment to adjust the boundaries so that we can create a new lot boundary. Instead of that small one that's fronting Sunset, it would go back and actually, provide a bigger property that could be developed. So we have gotten those bids back. We have the surveyor lined up, and they should be starting next week to do the property line adjustment, and then we'll bring that forward.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, anything else? All right, I think that brings us to the end. Vanessa?
I move to adjourn.
Seconded by Valerie. All in favor of adjourning today, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, see you Wednesday evening.